Most people look at the idea of making money online the same way someone looks at a blank piece of paper and concludes it cannot become anything useful. The assumption being that the starting condition, the emptiness itself, is proof of incompatibility with the outcome. The conventional belief is that online income requires a pre existing audience, a recognizable brand, a marketable skill, a product already developed, ideally, some startup capital to accelerate the whole process. Without these things, the entire enterprise seems structurally closed. But that belief, as widespread and confidently stated as it is, collapses the moment the actual origin stories of significant online businesses are examined with any seriousness. The person arriving at online income with zero followers, zero capital, zero product, zero roadmap is not behind the person who started with advantages, because the constraint of having nothing to protect is one of the most powerful creative accelerators that exists in any competitive environment. Edison operated out of a borrowed workspace with minimal equipment. The pressure of having almost nothing to work with is directly what produced the obsessive iteration responsible for over 1,000 patents. The internet rewards this exact profile: the person with low overhead, genuine desperation. No legacy system demanding protection, at a rate that consistently exceeds the rewards offered to the comfortable professional who has too much to lose by experimenting aggressively and failing publicly in the process. The mechanical reason for this pattern is straightforward. Constraints force specificity. A person with unlimited resources can afford to build in multiple directions simultaneously, spreading attention across numerous possibilities and thereby reducing the probability that any single direction receives the depth of focus required for breakthrough results. A person with almost no resources must choose one direction with extreme care and then pursue it with complete commitment because the cost of being wrong is immediate and personal. This focused intensity produces a level of understanding that diluted effort cannot match. The person working from Constraint learns the actual mechanics of their chosen domain rather than collecting a broad surface familiarity with many domains. They develop pattern recognition through repetition rather than exposure. They build systems that work because they must work, not because they are theoretically elegant. This is why bootstrap startups that began with near zero capital often outperform well-funded competitors in the same space. The discipline enforced by resource scarcity produces better decision-making at every stage. Congratulations. The absence of a formal degree or professional credential is treated almost universally as a disqualifying condition, as though a certificate from an accredited institution represents the only legitimate path into expertise, authority, or recognized earning potential in any field. The internet, however, operates on an entirely different credentialing system, one built around demonstrated output rather than documented enrollment. The gap between those two systems is enormous and growing wider every year. Mr. Beast, whose actual name is Jimmy Donaldson, withdrew from college within weeks of starting because he had calculated with considerable precision that a 4-year degree would consume the exact window he needed to master the YouTube algorithm. That calculation proved accurate. The channel now generates estimated annual revenue exceeding $200 million. Produced by a person with no formal training in media, business, or content production whatsoever. The formal education system was designed for a world where information was genuinely scarce and access to expertise required institutional gatekeeping as a practical necessity. But the internet dissolved that scarcity almost entirely and replaced it with an environment where depth of focused self-directed practice consistently outperforms breadth of passive institutional exposure. A person who invests 300 concentrated hours into studying copywriting, video production, data analysis, or e-commerce logistics will measurably outperform a person who sat through 2 semesters of loosely related coursework without deliberate application. This was because the mechanism of learning that produces actual skill is focused repetition with feedback, not scheduled attendance. The absence of a credential in this environment is not a liability. It is a quiet signal that the person in question is operating outside the institutional framework that was never designed to produce internet income in the first place, has therefore not been trained to believe that certain paths are closed. The self-taught person also retains a crucial advantage in adaptability. Formal training typically embeds specific methodologies, best practices, and established protocols that were relevant when the curriculum was designed, but often become obsolete before the training concludes. A person who taught themselves through direct market feedback learns what actually works right now, in real-time conditions, rather than what theoretically should work based on prior models. This matters enormously in domains where the underlying platform or technology is changing rapidly. The person who learns social media marketing through formal coursework may be executing strategies based on algorithms that have already been substantially modified or replaced. The self-taught person, by contrast, learned by testing approaches against live feedback and discarding what no longer produces results. This is rapid iteration disguised as education. Now, beginning later than most, starting at 35, 42, or 50, while others began in their early 20s, is treated as a permanent and irreversible disadvantage. as though the person who starts first retains that lead forever, regardless of what the late arrival brings to the process. The biological reality challenges this assumption directly, because the human prefrontal cortex, that governs long term planning, accurate risk assessment, impulse regulation, the ability to sustain effort through ambiguity without catastrophizing, does not reach full structural maturity until approximately age 25. Many researchers in developmental neuroscience place that timeline considerably later for full functional integration. The person who begins building an online income stream at 38 brings something that a 22-year-old structurally cannot access: a fully developed capacity to evaluate risk without distortion, filter bad advice without ego involvement, recognize patterns from decades of real-world experience across multiple domains, maintain consistent output through setbacks that would have derailed an earlier version of the same person. Colonel Harlan Sanders was 62 years old when he began franchising Kentucky Fried Chicken, following a lifetime of accumulated financial failure. Built one of the most recognized food operations in global commercial history from that late beginning. Ray Kroc was 52 when he acquired the McDonald's system and restructured it into a worldwide franchise model that transformed modern food distribution. The late start does not subtract from the outcome. It compounds the judgment required to make the right decisions when the right decisions actually matter. And that is not all. Because the person with no existing social media following, no established platform, no inherited audience is also the person who has never learned to mistake applause for accuracy. An audience of zero means that the first 100 people who find the content, the product, or the offer do so entirely because of its actual quality, not because of platform momentum, not because of prior loyalty, not because an algorithm is surfacing familiar names to familiar followers out of habitual association. This zero baseline condition creates a natural quality filter that large creators actively struggle to replicate after the fact. This was because an existing audience will engage with almost anything familiar and thereby masks the signal of what genuinely works with a stranger, who has no prior reason to stay. The most durable online revenue streams were built by people who began with no following and were therefore forced to develop a precise and almost obsessive understanding of what a person with no prior loyalty and no existing goodwill would find valuable enough to exchange time and money for. And that understanding, earned through the friction of building from absolute zero, is the asset that sustains income long after the initial growth phase has ended and novelty alone can no longer carry the operation forward. The person who looks at all of these conditions, no money, no degree, no early start, no audience, and sees a collection of disqualifications, is looking at the same image as someone who sees camouflage as an impenetrable barrier, rather than a pattern waiting to be read differently. Every named constraint in that list is a description of the exact starting condition that produced the most resilient online businesses currently operating. This was because adversity in the early stages forces the kind of fundamental problem solving that comfort systematically prevents. The market does not ask for a biography, a credential, a verified following count, or a polished origin story. It asks only whether the value being offered is real, whether the person behind it understands the problem being solved with genuine depth, whether the output is consistent enough to be found by the people who need it most.